Donald B. Smith taught Canadian history at University of Calgary from 1974 through 2009. He has a brand new book out. It's called Seen But Not Seen: Influential Canadians and the First Nations from the 1840s to Today. And one of the First Nations gentlemen that is covered in the new book by Donald B. Smith, called Seen But Not Seen, is Frederick Ogilvie Loft, a very important early 20th century First Nations political leader who attended school in Caledonia. And Donald, you're going to tell us about Fred Loft and his start on the banks of the Grand River.
I will do so with great pleasure. And first, though, we must give his name in Haudenosaunee world, which is Onondaga, and his English name is Fred Loft. He is a remarkable character, and of all the 15 characters in my book, he's not actually a principal character because my book's on non-Aboriginals and their perceptions of the First Nations. But I include, oh boy, I would say at least half a dozen Indigenous people as well in a secondary role because the focus is on non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous. Now, Fred Loft, born in 1861, and on the Grand River, Six Nations territory. His group, he was, of course, Six Nations, there's quite a few groups, it's the United Nations, and he was a member of the largest group, the Mohawk. His parents were farmers. They had a 200-acre farm, just well, west of Caledonia, and it was a family. They're a Christian family. They were, but respected the traditional religion as well. They had members of their family were Christian and traditional. So it's a complex situation, and anything dealing with Six Nations is extremely complex. And please, I want at the outset to make clear, I'm not any big guru on the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee. The culture is so rich, the literature is so abundant, and the knowledge is so deep. No, what I'm doing here is just introducing this character, Fred Loft, who comes from a farming family in the Six Nations territory, and they three brothers. The older brother went to residential school, Mohawk Institute, and he was there for 3 years. He tried to escape 3 times, but he finished. He stayed 3 years. But Fred was like his old. He was quite a rebel. He liked to train wild horses at home on the farm, and the residential school experience just was not for him. He was there for 1 year, 1874, and now he's a teenager, and that's it. I'm not doing this again. And parents are, well, perhaps concerned. I'm not sure. I don't have the data on that. But nevertheless, they went along with it. Now, this is Indigenous, It's not this sort of you do this, you do that sort of thing. You just interfere with somebody's will and whatnot. So no, the parents, I can see it totally. No, it's fine. That's fine, Fred. So Fred begins to switch to Caledonia. He's going to go to school in Caledonia, and he walks 15 miles round trip every friggin' day. And then he reaches, well, I imagine that was for a year or two, and he's a bright guy. His model was a Mohawk from Six Nations who'd become a medical doctor. It was a man called Bomberry, and Bomberry had become a medical doctor, and that was Fred's ideal. Bomberry died young, though. He got his degree from McGill and then passed away because of, well, I think it was smallpox, I think it was. It doesn't matter. He died. And so it was a great tragedy, but the role model was set. Fred's then at school. And after the finishing his elementary education in Caledonia, I would think probably just a year or so, he entered high school. So he's this is extraordinary. First Nations person on his own. And how's he paying for it? He's doing odd jobs. And eventually, because of the high school studies and his jobs, he has to pay for this, he lives in Caledonia. He boards there. And there he finishes his high school, which is extraordinary, sir. And it was tough because there's a lot of discrimination. Nevertheless, he's learned what the Six Nations elders, chiefs, one of the sayings that I picked up anyways, is that you have to have a skin 7 thumbs thick. didn't hurt him. Prejudice didn't hurt him. He kept on, and he graduates from school. It's hard. Hard to get a job. The prejudice is pretty strong and all, but he wasn't deterred. He well, several jobs. He worked in the lumber business and timber business for a couple of years. He got a business education at Belleville. He went to the Belleville, Ontario, had a business school. He went there, and was a reporter for the Brantford paper for a while. So he's very enterprising and whatnot. And eventually, though, he gets his break. Yeah, he was a liberal. And the Liberals are in power provincially, and the Liberal Party, that is, and he's able to get a government job. So he goes to Toronto, and there he will be for over 30 years at that civil service job. Never got promoted, which was his big disappointment. And anyways, though, he's in Toronto, so he relocates. Now at this point, he's very much a very proud First Nations person. However, he's in the city, and he's adjusted. He marries a Canadian. Yes. Well, in Chicago, a chance meeting with a Canadian who lived in the United States, Alpha Northcote. They fell in love. He married her, so they're together in Toronto, and they were very active in Toronto. They had they both played piano, so they'd have musical entertainments at their home. They went to theater. They frequented the racetrack. They had a full life. She was involved in he was involved in the Loyalists Association because, of course, the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawks were allies of the British Crown, and that's how they came here with Joseph Brant. So, anyways, they have a full life, and things are coming along. It is a frustration, though, and he is very concerned about the way the treatment of the Haudenosaunee. But, however, it's hard to translate that. He doesn't see his opportunity until there is indeed an opportunity. He is educated. He's proven himself, and he has friends. Like, he knew Adam Beck, who was the founder of Ontario Hydro, and he knew some heavyweight people in town, and well-respected gentlemen. Gave public talks. He applied for vacancy, the superintendent of the Six Nations Territory, a government position. Well, this is the last person the federal government would appoint to be the superintendent of the Six Nations. A very powerful job, but of course a government-controlled one. No way, this man knew accounting. He knew the ripoff of the Grand River Navigation Company. That is something. Boy, the radio station should, Six Nations people they take the mic on that one. This was trust funds were spent without their knowledge on building a canal system along the Grand River. And it was a joke. It was worse. It was a tragedy. It's horrific because the railways came in and the navigation system never, nothing. It was just a waste of money. And anyways, in other words, Fred Loft, he knew all about that. He'd done some research in that. And so they're sure not going to appoint him. So he continues on in Toronto, visits his mother lived a very ripe old age, and he'd visit her and stuff. It's interesting. I met his niece, Bernice, and Bernice told me it was it's so rich, this story. I was able to interview people that knew him, and this is all 25 years ago. But Bernice told me that it was kind of amusing because when Fred came back, and he'd go to church, and after church, everyone yakking and having good talk, catching up socially and all, Fred would mix up his Mohawk a little. And I hate to say something ill of him, but it's true. He'd been away so long. He wasn't speaking Mohawk. His wife didn't know Mohawk. But he had a full life there, and he brought his family, his two daughters. I had the good fortune to meet one of his daughters, actually. And alas, it was too late. She had Alzheimer's. But anyways, I did meet her. And there were some moments there where she was she was a very good person, but I just didn't, unfortunately, get that much information. But I did meet her, and that was a electrical charge for me. Okay, now, war comes on. World War I, big doings. And Fred had always been in the militia. He was a very fit man, tall, erect, very competent physically, and he was 10 years over the age limit. That is, you had to be, I think it was 45 or something. He was 10 years over, and he enlisted. Wow. And he fooled them. They had no idea. He was so physically fit. He seemed like a young fellow. Well, he's joined up the army then and did some recruiting, actually, as I recall. But then he went overseas. And he was with eventually the forestry unit. They made they in France, they were in timbered areas and they forested areas and they would cut ties for the railway, for the railway lines into the front lines in Flanders. And you know, it's well known because 100 years ago now, World War I, what a disaster. Here he is, Fred Lott, right there. And he was very proud of his troops. But in the end, he oh, he had actually the king. The king. He met the king, in a military review, and then he retires back to back to Canada. Now here's where the action starts. Here's where the contribution starts. Now I hope I've given you the ingredients. He's a proud Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and he's in the city. He's got all the life skills that he needs to perform in the larger society, but he has this desire to do something bigger, and that is he gets this idea because, of course, this wonderful story of the League of the Iroquois. You know, it's beautiful. It should be memorized by every student in, I don't know, the Grand River for sure. They already do know it. The Indigenous people know it, but the non-Indigenous, the richness. This is world class. How the League of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee was founded, and great cultural figures and all the 5 nations, later 6, come together. It's beautiful. That was his inspiration because he decided the way to get things going for the First Nations in Canada is to come together, organize, and Fred Loft called this meeting, right, 6 Nations there, and they met in late 1918, and it grew. But he had no support, you see, he had no funding. It's all him. He's got a government job, and he has a typewriter. It's that simple. He can type. And he sends out these letters across Canada and he gets a response. This is why I admire him so. Absolute total. No, all on his own. No support. Keeping on, not giving up. And he gets traction. And of course, the government gets concerned. Now, we can't get into this too deeply. That's why you've got to get my book. There's a gentleman called Duncan Campbell Scott. And he was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, or Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs. And he was a real penny pincher. He was a good representative of his times. He had no conception of like, it's just absolute no imagination at all for an independent First Nations entity. He wanted them all. He wanted assimilation. In those days, people used the word assimilation. Then we started using integration, and now this is called cultural assimilation. That's what was happening. And the Duncan Campbell Scott, the civil servant, had no respect for Fred Loft's organization. No funding, nothing, no support. And he put spokes in the wheel. He put sticks in the wheels. He tried to, well, he just was totally opposed to it, told agents to report his activities and followed him. And nevertheless, Fred Loft made progress. Okay, great. So we're really, Fred though is determined to keep going, and he gets some, some missionaries help him. I mean, this First Nations world, this Indigenous world, is so full of surprises. That's why I've stayed around for half a century. You never can predict what's going to happen. In Western Canada, a couple of missionaries back him. Like, because they see what's happening. This is atrocious how the First Nations are being treated. The treaty rights ignored, the funding so poor, the education substandard. I mean, honestly. Well, anyways, just to give you an example of Duncan Campbell Scott, he gets out and starts working against this Roman Catholic priest in Alberta who was sending on the letters of Fred Loft to the people themselves. It's just marvelously rich. And I think I've got about 8 pages on it in my book. It deserves a full length treatment, but it won't be me. Come on, I spent canon, but it's just a marvelous story, and it's very, very incredible. He keeps at it, and it gets worse and worse and worse. The desire of the Canadian government to bring the First Nations into the mainstream society, to eliminate Indian status, is intense. And in 1927, for example, the federal government changes the law, and if you solicit funds for land claims, you can. That's a criminal act. This is pretty. I mean, this is just about it. And then they start to try and get Fred Loft. And he's away actually for 5 years. In 4 years, his wife's people are in Chicago, so he was getting. He just took a break. But when he comes back, they're still after him. 1928 to his death in 1932, harassing him. Unbelievable. So, well, what did he do? He planted the seeds. He planted the seeds of, well, Assembly of First Nations. This is the first pan-Indian organization and across Canada, and done by one person with a typewriter. It's extraordinary, and under great odds. And I can't begin to tell you. Well, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that historical volume, which is number 1. There's parts 1 and 2. That's about residential schools, but there's also allusions to other things that are happening. This is really the dark times for the First Nations in terms of relationships with the federal government. And then we have the Depression. There's no money, and certainly there's not money. The amount of cash going to the Indigenous world is reduced even more. So it's hard times. Fred Loft soldiers on, and he dies in 1934. It's pretty uphill. It's very, very sad. However, I'm very pleased to announce that a big announcement. Here it goes. It hasn't yet, the plaque hasn't been put up yet, but it's in the works. Fred Loft has been designated a person of national significance by the Historic Sites Board of Canada. So Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. And so that's a great, great honor. He's been given this designation, and there will be a plaque. And hope, well, I don't know. You have to go to them to ask what's going on. It takes a long time. It's a real process, a real vetting, and then they have to have a spot for the plaque and what have you. But it's a great tribute. I feel like I've certainly, my part's done. I can hang up my skates now.
What a fascinating man, and perseverance, and he had vision, and the fact that he came from the banks of the Grand River is a pretty amazing piece of Indigenous history that we should be very proud of, and we should listen and we should learn more about these kinds of Indigenous stories that we just didn't have any idea about, and just how amazing some of these folks, their vision and their leadership really was.
Thank you very much, and Caledonia should be proud too.
Donald B. Smith, the new book is called Seen But Not Seen, Influential Canadians and the First Nations from the 1840s to Today. It's available wherever fine books are sold. And Donald, thank you so much for our chat this afternoon. And we can do this again.
Great.